to YMCA of San Francisco's Youth Classes for All. My name is Alex and I'm going to be your instructor for today's STEAM class. What is STEAM? So STEAM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, Arts, and Mathematics. So today's activity, our Snowstorm in a Jar, is going to tick some of those boxes of what science is. So we're going to be using some science in the form of chemistry today. We're going to be using some art because it's going to look beautiful just like an art piece. And we're also going to be using a little bit of mathematics with some of our measurements today. So before we get started, what we'll need today is a glass jar. So today I have a 1,000 milliliter flask, and you do not need to have this at home with you, but you can use any clear jar or glass. We'll need some baby oil, some water. So I already have my water in here right now, and I'll explain how much we'll need to put in later. You'll need some white paint. You don't have to use white paint if you don't want to. It's totally up to you. You can use any color you want if you want some different colored snow today. You'll need a stirrer. So I'm using a paintbrush today, and you can use anything you want at home to help you stir your mixture together. You'll need some alka-seltzer tablets. And this is an optional ingredient, but you can use some food coloring to kind of change the background of our snowstorm today. All right, so for today's activity, please feel free to follow along with me, and if not, you can just watch and do the activity at home later on your own time. All right, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we'll need to grab our glass and fill it up 1/4 of the way with water. So right now I have some murky water in here, and it's because it has a little bit of paint in it, and I already skipped to a little bit to a next step. But if you're putting water in your glass, you're going to want to make sure that it's filled up 1/4 of the way. So if I was to cut this flask in fourths, or 4 sections evenly, we're going to fill it up 1 section's worth of water. All right, once we have that, we're going to take our paint. So I'm going to use white today because it's going to be like snow. And I would love for it to snow here in San Francisco. But today we're just going to make it snow right here in the container today. So the next step is adding about 2 teaspoons or 2 tablespoons or 2 teaspoons, depending on the size of your glass, of paint. So I have a huge flask here. So I'm going to make sure I put enough paint to really mix in with that water. I'm going to take my stirrer and kind of swirl it around to make sure that that paint is all mixed in with that water that we have. All right, and I'm going to show you. We're going to want our mixture to resemble milk. So if you're looking at your mixture, I'm going to come around and show you, it should look like 1/4 of your glass is filled with some milk today. So this is about the consistency that we'll want it to look like before we get started. If you're seeing that it's a little too murky, you can go ahead and add some more white paint. So I'm going to add a little bit more and get a little crazy today. And go ahead and swirl it around, and I'm going to mix it up a little bit more to make sure it's all combined. Perfect. All right, so now that we have our milky mixture of water and paint into our jar, we're going to slowly add in some baby oil. You can use any kind of oil at home. It does not have to be baby oil. You can use vegetable oil or any cooking oil. It's just going to look a little yellow in color compared to baby oil, which is mostly clear in color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly pour in that baby oil right into that mixture that we made. So I'm tilting my glass a little bit so that way the oil goes in a lot smoother and just sits right on top of that water mixture that we made before. I'm going nice and slow so I don't make any messy bubbles inside of our container, because that will just make it really hard to see our mixture and our chemical reaction take place. All right, beautiful. So what we have right now is a very thick layer of oil right here on top of our water and paint mixture. So before we go on to the next step, I would love to talk about the science of what is going on right here. So every object is made up of atoms. So I'm made up of atoms, this table is made up of atoms, and you are made up of atoms. So atoms come together to form what we call molecules. So those are a bunch of atoms coming together to create different types of molecules in our world. So the molecule for water, for example, what we put in the first place is H2O. So it has 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. So that molecule comes together, and we like to call that molecule a polar molecule. Polar molecules are attracted to each other. So they like to be near each other, and they like to be really compact together. The baby oil in this mixture is made up of carbon and hydrogen atoms. So a bunch of hydrogen and carbon atoms come together to make this baby oil molecule that you see here. And that molecule is very different than our water molecule. These ones are called nonpolar molecules. So nonpolar molecules are what we call hydrophobic, which is another way of saying water-fearing or afraid of water or hates water. So oil, as a molecule, hates water, does not want to be mixed in with it. So nonpolar, which is the oil, and polar molecules, which is the water, do not mix, which is why we have this layer of oil sitting right on top of our mixture of paint and water. So paint is also mostly made up with water, which is why it's easy to mix into the water in the beginning. So that's why we did that mixture before we added our oil to the top of our mix. So what we're seeing right now is not just nonpolar and polar molecules in one glass. We're also seeing something called density. Density is how close molecules are to each other, so how compact they get to each other. So some molecules really like to be close together, like water molecules, and so that makes them more and more dense. So density also has to do with how much mass they take up inside of an object. So although the oil is taking up more space in our container, the water has more density, because water molecules like to be really, really compact into each other. So they like to be really close together, making them more dense, which is why the water falls to the bottom and the oil sits on top. So we're seeing a few different science terms right now happening inside of our jars. All right, so the next option we can do, or the next step that we can do for our science activity, is we can add some blue food coloring into our mix. So this is only going to tint a little bit of that baby oil, and just like the paint, food coloring is mostly made with water, so it's not going to mix as much into that oil as we want it to, but this will give it a tint like if we were in the sky and snow was falling from a blue sky. So I'm going to go ahead and add some blue food coloring and see what that does to our mix. It might just sink to the bottom, which is another way we can tell that that food coloring has the same density as water. So I'm going to try to mix that in a little bit into our mixture. And what I'm seeing here is that it doesn't want to mix too completely, so it might even alter the look of our paint in there, but it might tint a little bit of our oil, which is what we want to see, to kind of make that effect of it being a blue sky in our jar. But that food coloring created some kind of reflection or tint into our oil, so it made our oil look a little blue, which is exactly what we want to kind of mimic a sky. And we still have our white mixture at the bottom. It has a little bit of food coloring because, like I said, the food coloring has the same density as the water, so it just sunk right into the bottom. but it just made a little tint into that oil, which is exactly what we want. All right, the next step is when it gets wild. So we are going to open up our alka-seltzer packet, and inside they normally put in 2 tablets. So I'm going to take that tablet, I'm going to break it up into 4 pieces. So just like in the math that we did before, we're going to break them up into 1/4 pieces. So 1 piece out of 4 into 4 pieces to make 1 whole piece of alka-seltzer. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take that 1/4 piece that I broke off. So I broke it first in half and then a second time in half until we have this little tiny piece of alka-seltzer. So I have a big glass here, so we're going to see how much of a reaction we'll get with just 1 little tiny piece of alka-seltzer. So let's go ahead and see what happens. So I'm going to drop that in, and automatically I'm going to see some bubbling happening. And from what you can see, it's starting to create little balls or droplets coming up from the bottom and going way up to the top. I'm going to see what happens when I add more alka-seltzer into my container. So since I have a large container, that reaction didn't look as big as I wanted it to. So I'm going to add probably 2 more pieces of that alka-seltzer and see what happens when I add those 2. Automatically, I'm seeing a bigger reaction. I'm going to bring it up to you again so we can see it up close. What you'll see is that there's these streams of little droplets of blue coming up in our container. And so some of that blue food coloring mixed in with that paint. So if I was to do this again, I might try to just use the white instead, just to see it be snowy. But sometimes some snow can have some blue tint to it, I think. And since it's science and since it's kind of art, we can make it look our own way that we want it to. So right now, there's little droplets of oil going up, or tinted water actually, going up to the top and falling back down. I'm going to add a big tablet of alka-seltzer just to get crazy. So I'm going to use that last tablet to see if we can see an even bigger creation. So let's open the last tablet up. I have 1 large tablet, and I might break it up into pieces, but I'm still going to use the whole thing. So I'm going to break it in half first. Oops, it kind of broke in a little different way. It kind of broke into thirds. So I'm going to actually leave it the way it is. So it broke into thirds this time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop all 3 in at the same time and see what happens. Are we ready? On a count of 3. 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to bring it up so we can see it closer. But right now, it looks like a snowstorm is happening. So right before, it just looked like it was just a little bit of a drizzle of snow. And now, oh, it created a whole foam mess inside of my flask. So now we can't even see those droplets. That's incredible. So it foamed up everything inside of our reaction. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is what is actually going on inside of this jar. So I'm going to set this aside, and eventually that alka-seltzer is going to kind of fade away. It'll be kind of just incorporated into our mixture, and it'll settle down, and we'll see again some oil levels and the paint with the white paint in it and the water at the bottom all separate back into each other. So eventually we'll see our layers a lot clearer. So I'm going to let that settle, and we can talk about what is happening inside that jar. So the first things we talked about was how water and oil were separated due to their density and due to them being both polar and non-polar molecules that don't want to mix. So polar like polar molecules and non-polar like non-polar molecules. So if you ever opened up your refrigerator and found some salad dressing, like balsamic vinaigrette salad dressing, you'll notice that already it separates into different layers. So you'll have your vinegar, and your oil separating from each other. So before you use your salad dressing, oftentimes you're going to want to shake it to try to get them to join together a little bit more. So right now, after we've already added that alka-seltzer, the alka-seltzer acted like us shaking a jar of salad dressing. So now that we've stopped shaking it with the alka-seltzer, now that it's dissolved into the mix, it's going to separate back down into oil on top and that water, paint, and even food coloring mixture at the bottom. So what happens here is alka-seltzer has an ingredient called sodium bicarbonate. So that means it's kind of an acidic reaction that happens inside of our jar. So when you add alka-seltzer to water, it will react and release that sodium bicarbonate as in a form of carbon dioxide. So when we breathe in, we're breathing in oxygen. And when we breathe out, our body changes that oxygen into carbon dioxide. So we're releasing carbon dioxide into the air. Kind of like when plants need carbon dioxide, they breathe in carbon dioxide and they release oxygen into the atmosphere where we need to breathe. So what happens here is that alka-seltzer is creating carbon dioxide bubbles that form once they reach the bottom where that water and that paint mixture is. And it's creating these little bubbles of carbon dioxide that shoot right up to the top of our container. And they are kind of create a layer of bubbles right at the top. So those bubbles eventually get so heavy at the top and there's nowhere to go but to reach that top of the oil that they just end up falling back down to the bottom and kind of go back and forth from the bottom to the top. So what's happening there is that they're not being incorporated into the oil, so that's why you're seeing all of those bubbles going up to the top. So once they get to the top, they get so heavy that they can't stay up there anymore and they fall back down. So I'm going to add that last bit of alka-seltzer and show one more time what that looks like. So we're going to add the alka-seltzer, which has sodium bicarbonate. Going to drop it into the mix, and it's going to create those little bubbles again. And those bubbles are filled with carbon dioxide. So when you open up a can of soda or a sparkling can of water, you will notice these little tiny bubbles at the top that come up and they pop. And even when you drink from it, you'll taste a little bit of those bubbles. That's exactly what these bubbles of paint and water are doing. They have the carbon dioxide inside of them. They go to the top, and since there's this surface tension at the top, they can't break through. So they get so heavy that they fall down. And the reason they form these balls is because the oil does not incorporate that water and carbon dioxide that's in it. So you can see them really clearly through the oil, and it makes it look like a snowstorm in a jar. Pretty amazing stuff. So if you had this in a jar that you can put a cap on, you can keep it as is and you can test out the theory to see if you could combine oil and water together if you wanted to. Or you can go ahead and add more alka-seltzer if you have more tablets. You can try as many alka-seltzers as you can and see if it will even release more carbon dioxide and see if maybe it'll overflow with all these bubbles that come up. And you can even experiment with adding some other ingredients at home that might have sodium bicarbonate, which would be baking soda. So if you have baking soda at home, the same reaction can occur when you add this to water. So today, we created a snowstorm in a jar and learned about density, about molecules, about why oil and water don't mix, and about how the chemistry in an alka-seltzer tablet can react with the water and the oil and create a snowstorm in a jar. Thank you all so much for joining me today in making our snowstorm in a jar. We explored the STEAM elements of science through chemistry, which was that chemical reaction of the sodium bicarbonate in our mix. We also did some art because we added some colors and we made something so beautiful and so artistic that it can be nothing but be called art. And we also learned a little bit of mathematics and figuring out how much water to oil we want. So clearly, we want more oil than water in our mixture. And we figured out how to create snow in San Francisco, in California, where it never snows in San Francisco. So thank you all so much for joining me. If you want to join me in other virtual classes, you can go to YMCASF.org and go to Classes for All live schedule. We'd love to see you there. Thank you so much.
Did you know that YMCA of San Francisco never closed? When shelter-in-place happened, we could no longer provide in-person programming. We quickly shifted to provide youth and family programming virtually. As early as April, we started providing on-demand activities in our YMCA of San Francisco YouTube channel.
For this video, we're going to be making a geodesic dome.
Is the language of numbers.
In addition, we have a regular schedule of activities for our youth and families to join live. We feature read-alouds, yoga, family Zumba, arts and crafts, drawing clubs, and more. So don't miss out on our virtual youth and family offerings. Visit www.ymcasf.org for more info and class schedules.